Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Evening Upstairs program sponsored by the McCracken County Public Library and also co-sponsored by WKMS 91.3 FM. I am Brian Clardy. I am a newly minted professor of history at Murray State University and the current chair of the Kentucky Humanities Council and past chair of the Kentucky Oral History Commission. And I want to thank you all for being here on this beautiful early summer's evening. By training, I am a diplomatic and political historian by training. I do a lot of things with campaigns, elections, politicians, controversial politicians, and diplomacy. But this particular area has been near and dear to my heart and has been for a long time. And the area we're going to be talking about tonight is segregation in public accommodation with an emphasis upon Cherokee State Park, which is located not too far from here in Marshall County. And so the first thing I want to do before we get into the minutia of segregation within Western Kentucky and the need for Cherokee State Park at that time is to put segregation into context. Remember, slavery ends with the end of the Civil War in 1865. The 13th Amendment actually ended slavery. Of course, it was prompted by the Emancipation Proclamation signed by President Abraham Lincoln, but it was the 13th Amendment that put an official end to chattel slavery. A couple of more amendments were adopted and added to the Constitution, amended to the Constitution, such as the 14th Amendment, which gave African Americans citizenship and also guaranteed, and I want you to hold on to this for a little bit, the idea of equal protection under the law. Equal protection under the law. That is ensconced in the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868. Just keep that phrase in mind. Of course, the 15th Amendment, ratified 2 years after that, gave African American men the right to vote. Women, of course, would not get the right to vote for another 50 years of any race. Women were marginalized like that politically and did not receive their full citizenship rights, honestly, into the early part of the 20th century, and that needs to be emphasized. The end of the Civil War brought about a period for 12 years called Reconstruction. And what Reconstruction was is that the South, of course, had their entire economy decimated by the war, and you had millions of African Americans who were now newly freed, who were wandering about the South, many of which had only had the skills necessary to do the type of work in the fields and road construction and things of that sort, but were now being mainstreamed into the fabric of American life. But there were, of course, people who had a major problem with that. Groups like the organization we know of as the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, established on Christmas Eve in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1865, and other similar groups. And so when Congress came up with a scheme to divide the American former Confederacy into certain districts and sending in federal troops to make sure that civil rights laws were enforced and that vigilante violence would be kept to a minimum, if not eradicated altogether. That was the period that we call Congressional Reconstruction, or by its detractors, Radical Reconstruction or Bayonet Rule. And that lasted all of 12 years. And so by the time we get to the 1876 presidential election, there's this view in the South that, you know, if we're trying to get past our defeat in the war, we want to become part of the mainstream of the country, we want to become both agriculture and industry, and the view in the North that we have done enough for these people, that the laws are in place, slavery's over, let's move on to other things. And so in the 1876 election, this is where Rutherford B. Hayes wins the presidency by one vote, one electoral college vote, having lost the popular vote to his Democratic opponent, New York Governor Samuel Tilden, the Democratic nominee, and a compromise was struck that Hayes would win the presidency, but one of the conditions of that was that the troops would be pulled out of the South. And that process begins in 1877. What happens after that is that the so-called Redeemer governments come back into place in the South. The old Confederate Guard comes back into power, and they begin to pass segregation statutes, black codes, and so to speak, basically disenfranchising and marginalizing people of color, the newly freed Americans who had been held in slavery for close to 300 some odd years. And so the question then becomes, well, what happened to the idea of equal protection under the law then? Well, this is where you got to bring in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court had this particular doctrine. They had two doctrines, actually, in which they took the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause and applied it first to big business to protect business from unnecessary taxes and representation, basically giving big business free rein, but also using the 14th Amendment, as you'll see in cases like the slaughterhouse cases and Plessy versus Ferguson, to say to the states, well, the states can pretty much do what they want to. The states have their laws, we have ours, and neither the twain shall meet. And so with the slaughterhouse cases, and certainly by the time we get to 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson, the segregation statutes were viewed as not violating the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Separate but equal after 1896 becomes the law of the land. American apartheid is in full effect. Now, that's just the legal and political ramifications of that. Let's look at the personal ones. Segregation was meant to demean. It was meant to give the detractors of African Americans pretext to harass, intimidate, and murder at will. The number of lynchings climbs exponentially high in the 1880s, 1890s, and early 20th century. It gives birth to the myth of the lost cause of the Confederacy, where now the Civil War is being told from a slightly different perspective. That the cause of the war was not about slavery, it was about states' rights. Right. But that it's totally recast in that way. The sad thing about it is two things. The South lost the war, but won the peace in the final analysis. And Kentucky, which never left the Union, now aligns itself with the values of the old Confederacy. And so segregation really begins to take root all over the American South, and especially right here. So what I'm saying here is that, segregation is going to impact the lives of most Kentuckians, especially here in the Jackson Purchase, where you're going to have separate schools, separate neighborhoods, separate funeral homes, separate graveyards, separate hospitals. It's going to be segregation from the cradle to the grave. And so the question then becomes for African Americans is, how do we negotiate that space? How do we now go back and retake our personhood, since it seems obvious that segregation, like slavery before it, was intended to kill our souls? That's the larger question. So you've got segregated neighborhoods, usually along the lines of race. This was the case throughout the American South, in most of the country, to be told, truth be told, but especially here in Western Kentucky. Now, the picture that you see, of course, on the right probably doesn't represent Western Kentucky, but you kind of get the idea that this is not going to be your typical African American neighborhood in Western Kentucky. But this one probably would be. This is from my hometown of Fulton, Kentucky. I was born in South Fulton, but I was raised across the streets in South Fulton, Tennessee. And this is a part of Fulton, Kentucky called Missionary Bottoms. And I knew this gentleman here who was taking a picture in front of one of the barbecue places. His name was Joe Newbern, and he was taking pictures of Missionary Bottoms before it was torn down in the early to mid 1970s. This was an example of those segregated neighborhoods in Western Kentucky. And of course, there were some communities within Western Kentucky that strongly, and I mean that emphatically, strongly opposed the idea of an African American presence. We call those sundown towns and sundown areas. Among the most notorious of those was towns like Benton, Kentucky, and Marshall County, deemed as a sundown town. And I invite you to read one of the classic works by James Loewen, his work on sundown towns. It is a classic study. It came out, I'd say less than 20 years ago. But what is a sundown town? A sundown town means that if you're African American and you show up in one of these towns, you better be out of that town before the sun goes down. Because if you are, you will get hurt. You will be swinging from a tree, dragged behind a car. You will not make it out alive. And there were several of those throughout the United States, and there was some right here in Western Kentucky. And so this needs to be understood that African Americans are constantly reminded of their sense of oppression, their sense of marginalization. This is an everyday fact in African American life in the post-Civil War and post-Reconstruction period. And definitely in the case of public schools. This was definitely true in the case of public schools, including right here in Paducah, Kentucky, including the town I live in now, Murray, Kentucky, including the city I grew up in, South Fulton, Tennessee. There were segregated schools, segregated teachers, segregated classrooms. And trust me when I tell you, those facilities were not equal. I did a study not too long ago, published it in the Tennessee Historical Quarterly about 14 years ago on the desegregation of South Fulton High School in 1962 and some of the conditions that I read about in the old Rosenwald School. Some of the oral history accounts were quite frankly deplorable, where you had outhouses in place of indoor toilets, and you had rooms that were kept warm by potbelly stoves as opposed to any type of central heating or anything. So trust me when I tell you, separate did not mean equal. But these were throughout the place. These were throughout this area in Fulton, Mayfield, Marshall County, Graves County, Paducah, McCracken County, Christian County, in Hopkinsville, where you had this strict system of apartheid running through K through 12. And then, of course, these are some examples. Milton High School. This is one of the schools in Hopkinsville. This is one of the schools in Graves County. These are examples of those segregated schools where, yeah, students did well. You had a lot of students who went on to do great things, but to be admitted into state institutions of higher education probably wasn't going to happen. Their options were very, very limited in that regard, at least up until the late 1960s. And speaking of those post-secondary education opportunities, Western Kentucky African American students who wanted to pursue higher education prior to Brown versus Board had some very limited options. They could attend Kentucky State University all the way in Frankfort. Kentucky State's a good school, but it's far from Fulton, far from Paducah. You know how far it is from here to Frankfort. It's far, far, far away from home. They could not go to, let's say, Murray State. They could not go to UT Martin. So they went to places like Kentucky State or Tennessee A&I, which is now Tennessee State University, or Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee, or if they were lucky like my aunt was, to get admitted into Wilberforce University in Ohio, but those were segregated schools. Or they could attend vocational schools like Western Kentucky College, which is now WKCTC, to learn a trade. But to get into one of the larger flagship schools in this area and throughout the states of Kentucky and Tennessee, it was not going to happen. It was segregation from cradle to grave. It was thorough and it was real. And these are some examples of some of the schools: Tennessee State University, Kentucky State, and others. This gives you an example of some of the options that were available to African American students. As I said, great schools, but just the sense that you know for a fact that by law and by policy, that you're not going to be allowed to attend certain schools of your choice? Can you imagine how dehumanizing that was? That was the whole point of segregation, was to dehumanize, to marginalize, to put in place what the philosopher Martin Buber called an I-it relationship, as opposed to an I-thou relationship, reducing a person from a status of a person to a thing, and that idea of soul murder that Nell Painter, the great historian, talks about. That was the whole purpose of this. The question emerges again, what do African American students and African American people, how do they negotiate those spaces? Well, one way was through the church. That was one major way, was the church. Martin Luther King, I believe, was the one person that said that the most segregated hour in America was 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings, and that was certainly the case. But the thing about the African American church is that it was segregated. It was, of course, going to a white church, if you're African American, was pretty much a bad idea. But if you did go to a church, you went to your neighborhood church, and this was the place where you could be yourself. And that answers the question, how do you negotiate those spaces where you're viewed as a nobody in the larger eyes of society? How do you go about recreating and recasting that? Because in the church, you're no longer boy, you're no longer uncle, you're no longer gal. You're a deaconess, you're a stewardess, you're reverend, you're elder, you're ma'am, you're Mrs. You could express yourself through the music and the liturgy and the preaching and the testifying. You learned and you were able to hone your skills at public speaking in Christmas programs, in Easter programs, on rally Sundays, on youth Sundays. And the church also provided an outlet where people could enjoy a sense of belonging. You have annual church homecomings, which was a big deal in the African American church because first of all, this is a place where you could sit down and eat in a non-segregated setting because no restaurant was going to allow you to come eat in there. But you could go to the church, into the back of the church or a picnic ground, and this is where Cherokee Park comes in, where you could go and enjoy a nice meal in a very comfortable setting where you belonged. In this case, the black church is a very, very important venue for personal development. And so you have Virginia Street, Missionary Baptist Church in Hopkinsville. You have Harrison Street here in Paducah. You had St. Paul in South Fulton, Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church, Antioch Missionary Baptist Church, Oak Grove in Martin, Tennessee. These were incubators that created a generation that stood against the vestiges of dehumanizing segregation. And the black church also created a great cadre of leaders that would tear those systems down, leaders like Samuel DeWitt Proctor, Ella Baker, Martin Luther King, and so many others. The black church gave birth to that. And I would invite you to read, this is another pet interest of mine too, read the writings of the late theologian James Cone, particularly some of his works like The Cross and the Lynching Tree, Black Theology and Black Power, and so forth. James Cone was one of the most important theological voices of the 20th and 21st centuries, and he talks about this quite extensively. In fact, Skip Gates, I will correct myself, Henry Louis Gates did a series not too long ago on the black church. It was on public television. If you get a chance to on KET, and I'm not advertising for KET. KET, you can get that on KET Passport, and you can watch the black church series, and it is remarkable. And it tells that entire story about the role that the church plays in asserting a sense of humanity among people of color. It was true of hotel accommodations. Now, I was just in a hotel in Nashville last night. 80 years ago, that was not going to happen. 70 years ago, that wasn't going to happen because I would not have been allowed in those particular spaces. And so how do you, when you're traveling on the road, how do you have a place where you can sleep overnight without having to drive over, pull over your car, and sleep on the side of the road or in a park in a very dangerous situation? Well, you could stay in the home of family and friends. That's making a lot of assumptions, but you could still stay in the home of a private home to work and welcome church delegations, student groups, entertainers, and so forth, because they could not find places where they could rest. Or could they? There was one such place called the Metropolitan Hotel right here in Paducah, Kentucky. Please check out that site. There's a lot of valuable history there. Who stayed there? Billie Holiday, Ike and Tina Turner, Louis Armstrong, politicians, musicians, pastors, writers, all stayed overnight right here in Paducah, Kentucky at the Metropolitan Hotel, and that place has been restored to its peak condition. Check it out. And of course, in my hometown of Fulton, Kentucky, there's the Hotel Tapadora, the Club Tapadora. They had a hotel in there as well where you could also stay. But no, you are not going to be checking into a Holiday Inn, Motel 6, Super 8, and Hilton if you were black in America 70, 80 years ago. It wasn't going to happen. But there were other places where you could stay and have that sense of somebodyness affirmed. It was segregation in hotels, hospitals, theaters especially, and I'm not going to repeat what they call seating in the balconies of movie theaters. Okay, I'll give you the decent one. One was called the Crow's Nest. I'll give you the nice one. And then, of course, there was Inward Heaven, of course, where if you wanted to go see Humphrey Bogart, you wanted to go see Joan Crawford, you wanted to go see Bette Davis, you had to sit in the balcony. In fact, it was marked colored only. And so, yeah, you had colored only, white only signs in every area of American life, especially in restaurants, especially in hospitals, especially in hotels and different other places. If you wanted to get a meal at a place, you usually had to go in the back of the place and order it to go. You would not be allowed to sit, and that's assuming they let you be served at all. That's a huge assumption. And segregated waiting rooms in hospitals, including the hospital I was born, Fulton Hospital in Fulton, Kentucky. Segregated waiting rooms. Segregated wards. Even when you're sick, you're not safe from being dehumanized and marginalized. So then, why the necessity for Cherokee Park? I have talked to several of my family members, my mother being one of them, and several people even before I got involved in the documentary that Tammy Holmes and Nancy Dawson put together about Cherokee Park. It was located in rural western Kentucky in Marshall County on Kentucky Lake. It was in existence from 1951 until segregation ended officially in 1963 and 64. But this was a very special place in the life of the local African American community, and not just the local African American community. It was a very special place in the eyes of people all across this country who would come to this beautiful public park and spend a day just or two or three just being allowed to be human and to be treated as such. And so Cherokee Park was that one respite. And there were others. There were others throughout the country. There were segregated parks all throughout the country. Some in Louisville, some in New York State, some in California. But we're talking about Western Kentucky, not too far from a sundown town. That's important. That's historic. So what were the origins of this? We got to go all the way back to the administration of Kentucky Governor Earl Clements in 1948. He makes a very important political decision. He appointed Harry Ward to serve as Commissioner of Conservation. That sounds like a boring job, but really it's not. It's very important because as Commissioner of Conservation, you are in charge of the state's parks, and there were several of them either having been established or in the process of being established. Those state parks were places where you could go play golf, where you could go play tennis, where you could rent a cabin, where you could go swim. There were a number of places where you could go hiking and bike riding and walking, things of that sort. Those green spaces, those creative spaces that Richard Florida talks about in his work. And he was in charge of that. And so during the administration of Governor Clements and the tenure of Commissioner Ward, the decision was made in the late 1940s to create in Western Kentucky state parks, one for black citizens, one for white citizens. Remember, Jim Crow is still the law of the land, separate but equal. It's still ensconced in American life. Keep that in mind. And so now you've got one state park that opens up. Kenlake Resort State Park opens in 1950. And it is for white citizens only. The next year, Cherokee Park opens. Well, of course, it was proposed in the late 1940s, but it actually opens. It's a reality by 1951. As I pointed out, African Americans from all over the country came to Cherokee Park from as far as New York, California, Arizona, Florida, Illinois, Wisconsin, North and South Dakota. They came from everywhere just to have fun, to go sit at an actual counter and not have to go to the back of the restaurant, to be addressed as sir and ma'am and not as boy and not as uncle and not as auntie or as gal. Can you imagine how refreshing that would be? And so this is where they go, a dining hall, or you could rent cabins, you could swim, you could have parties, you could picnic. Your churches could go there for a summer picnic. You could go there just to walk and not be bothered and to be free from the everyday hassles of racism in the land of the free and the home of the brave. But the park itself closed in 1964. It's definitely, actually, let me go back. 1963, Governor Combs signs an executive order to bring about an end to segregation in public accommodations, at least public ones, run by the state in Kentucky. 1964, Lyndon Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act that pretty much wipes out segregation in public accommodations with the stroke of a pen. This is the end of Jim Crow segregation in that regard by 1964. And so now the question then becomes, what's going to happen to places like Cherokee Park? That's the question. Is it still relevant? Now since black folks can go to Kenlake, now since black folks can go to Lake Barkley, what's going to happen to Cherokee Park? Well, this is where the producer of the film, one of the producers, Tony Clomax, this is where he adds this very poignant quote, and I think this is important. He says, during the height of Jim Crow in Kentucky, Cherokee Park operated from 1951 to 1964, just 2 miles from whites-only Kenlake Park. Black vacationers used the Green Book to travel safely through sundown towns to reach paradise, and this is that story. Now let me go back and unpack the Green Book. And I'm not talking about the great movie that Mahershala Ali did a few years ago. Great film about, and a lot of stuff about Don Shirley in that film, don't believe it. His family said it didn't happen. Some of it didn't. Some of it did, though. Let's be real. But that's not the point. What is the Green Book? The Green Book, if you're living, let's say, in New York City, and you want to travel throughout the country. Let's say you live in Chicago. Let's say you live here in the South, and you want to travel to a destination far from your home. First, you've got to make sure that you're prepared. You're not going to be able to stop at a restaurant. You're not going to be able to stop at a hotel of your choice, so you're going to bring your food with you. That's one. Secondly, you better hope and pray that your car is in working order. Make sure that your tires are okay, that your battery's okay, that you don't have a bad, I'm terrible with cars. Pardon? Oh yes, and that'll do it. Bad fan belt. Make sure that it's in perfect water pump. That's what I was thinking about. Make sure everything's in working order, because if your car breaks down in a sundown town, you are in trouble. And plus, so you need to know where you can stop to get gas, where you can stop to go to the bathroom, where you can stop to eat, where you can stop to stay overnight. And the Green Book that was put out, there's a whole dearth of literature now about the creation of the Green Book. I'm not going to bore you with that. But this is what black vacationers used in a country that they helped build in order to negotiate those spaces. And Cherokee Park was one of those places in the Green Book, featured very prominently, I might add, so that African American travelers could negotiate those spaces. And so this story ends up being told by Dr. Tammy Holmes, by Dr. Nancy Dawson, by Dr. Tony Clomax. Now, I've known Tammy and I've known Nancy for almost 30 years. And we were at SIU together. Nancy and I taught in the Black American Studies program together. Tammy was one of our students. I was a lecturer there. I was working on my doctorate, and I had a cross appointment in the Department of History and Black American Studies. And, you know, you graduate, you move on, you kind of lose touch with folks, so you think. So I'm sitting in my office. This is the late fall of 2021. I think we're about to break for Thanksgiving. And I get a call from Nancy Dawson. Okay, Nancy, where are you? She's in Dr. S.G. Carthel's office, over in the Office of Multicultural Affairs. I said, okay, good, welcome to Murray State. Yeah, what's going on? She said, we're putting together a documentary about Cherokee Park. You can imagine how big my ears perked up. I wanted to know more. She said, we're doing that, and next, in the beginning of the spring semester of 2022, we're going to do a symposium, a national symposium on segregation in public parks and public accommodations. Are you interested? I couldn't answer yes quick enough. And so a group of us throughout the country, of course, Mother Nature played some dirty tricks and some of our folks couldn't make it, but we got together for 2 days and we had panel discussions, paper presentations about some of those places, Chicken Bone Park and other places, Idlewild, different other places similar to Cherokee Park. And it was an amazing symposium for 2 days. And so I heard about the making of the documentary. I get a call, this time from Dr. Holmes. Would you like to be interviewed? I could not answer yes quick enough. And so got in the car, went down to Cherokee Park, you know, gave some comments and gave some quotes, went about my daily business. Homecoming weekend 2022 was the world premiere of the documentary. I know some of you want to see the documentary. I get that. But trust me when I tell you, Dr. Dawson and Dr. Holmes, they're very, 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 very guarded about that documentary. They don't want to just put it out on the web and have people, because you know what would happen if it got on YouTube. You know what would happen if it got on Tubi. All types of crazy things could happen. So what I encourage you to do is, we're going to look at the trailer for it in a minute, And we'll talk a little bit about what the documentary was all about, because I think this is a story that needs to be told and retold and ensconced permanently in the historical record. So the trailer for the documentary was put together and is distributed before the world premiere in the fall of 2022. And we're going to look at that trailer right now. And Brian, thanks a lot, buddy.
What Dr. Sweeney wanted was black and whites being able to go to the same parks together. We have all these public parks, and we have none that black folks can go to. And the first one was in Western Kentucky in Marshall County. It was also called Cherokee Park.
I was really taken by this place. Beauty, the history here. It was one of 6 that was a segregated park.
There was actually 2 parks. There was Cherokee, and then there was Kenlake State Park, which was mostly for whites.
Spaces like Cherokee Park was a place for African Americans to be treated as equals, camping out here, swimming, fishing, just enjoying the great outdoors.
In segregation, celebrity type African Americans with large sums of money, they would be at the same park as the everyday black person. And the middle class black people would be with the farm community.
In order to come here, you had to really seriously be prepared. What if your car breaks down? What if it breaks down in a sundown town?
The N-word do not be caught in the town after dark.
If you were black in an all-white town, you could not be in that town when the sun goes down, and it was a threat to your safety.
10,000 sundown towns had sprung up across the country by 1970. Some were the warning to African Americans not to let the sun go down on you was an unspoken rule.
African American people were not welcome at all state parks and at all facilities. We shouldn't lose sight of that history in our country.
It was so good that the white people wanted it.
It closed in 1964, and the government signed a bill in 1963 integrating the park system.
Whenever desegregation happened, we weren't in the room to decide the fate of what would happen in these parks.
Some of those old ghosts never died, they were never buried, and there are some people in the society that would like to take us back to that. It ain't gonna happen, not with this generation.
For I, Andy Beshear, Governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, do hereby proclaim November 18, 2021 as Historic Cherokee State Park Day.
The true mark of something special is not what you've done, it's what you're leaving behind for those who you have.
People have to understand it. We're just not here. You can't forget it. It's a part of us. And we got to hand this down to our younger people and let them understand who they are, who they really are.
And so that was what we were doing at the end of 2022. And this documentary has played in different film festivals throughout the United States. It's won a few awards, and it's something that we're quite frankly proud of, and that we wanted to continue to edit, do some more work on, see what we can do in terms of getting it on the larger national and global scene. And so the story of Cherokee Park has been told. It will be part of the record. It will start a lot of conversation. Hopefully it will generate a lot of research in my particular field for both the general audience and academicians alike. And so here begins the conversation. Now, first of all, I want to thank you for coming out on a very beautiful sunny day. You could have been doing anything, a number of things, and Paducah is a very nice town. In fact, we're going to go get something to eat afterwards, and I don't blame you if you do, but this is a great city. And so I want to thank you for your presence, and thank you all for being here. And I'm open to any questions that you may have later.